Yeah, I was watching the news and hearing from family members just like everyone else, right? And one of the things that struck me, and I write about this, in the first few months, maybe the end of April or the end of May, there was a report that came out of Richmond. I believe it was St. Petersburg or Richmond, Virginia, the city of Richmond, Virginia, or Norfolk, somewhere down in Southern Virginia. And of everyone that had died of COVID, right? This was in 2020. There was 14 folks that had died at that time. All of them except one was Black, right? I was hearing reports out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where there's a large Black population. I have family there. 70 and 80%, folks who have died of COVID are African American. So very quickly, right, as the data was coming in, we were getting reports where these spaces and places in the U.S. where there were large Black populations, Black folks were dying 2 to 1, right? Every white person that died, 2 Black folks died, even 2.5. When we went into the fall or later in summer, and someone who studies death, but really burial, cemeteries, mourning practices, I began to really look at how last rites were being just disrupted. I remember kind of reaching out to friends and colleagues that are funeral directors, and just with the Black funeral home, and the ways in which Black folks prepare for last rites. It's pretty lengthy. A person doesn't die on a Thursday and they're buried on a Friday. It's pretty lengthy. There's a wake, then there's a funeral, and there's a waiting time where family can come and gather, and all of that stuff, all of those very sacred things that help people in the Black community mourn and come together were just completely disrupted.
Ooh, that's really a story of great inequalities in the population of US. But can you explain it? What is at the background of those inequalities and those different approaches also of Black people and white people? The differences in the numbers, but also approaches of how to mourn, how to bury the person, and the rituals they did.
Yeah, that's a really good point, to just kind of chew on and discuss inequality, right? Because one of the things that's even coming out now in 2022 is that the pandemic, there's an equality with this pandemic. Like, no one is immune to it, right? And I think folks, at least here in the US, are forgetting what I just told you, right? That when you look at Black and brown population, the indigenous folks on reservations were just being decimated, right? And so you have to ask yourself, well, what was going on for this disease, right, to just impact the African American community, because that's what we're talking about specifically, in such a way that they were getting hit like this. Some of the reports that started coming out in 2020 was about pre-existing illnesses, right? In the Black community, there's already an uptick in asthma. There's already an uptick in diabetes and heart conditions, and all of these things that are going on. And that narrative switched quickly. Our surgeon, our general surgeon of the U.S. general surgeon, that narrative quickly and was racialized to say, Black folks need to take care of themselves, right? They need to stop eating fatty foods and lay off the alcohol. Like, this is what, someone with a background in public history was trying to say, again, blaming the victim, right? That this is the reason why Black folks were dying. And that is that's a historical, stereotypical trope in this country, right? That somehow Black bodies are diseased, right? When you look at the Tuskegee experiment, you could go back to slavery and how our bodies were exploited. And so that was something serious going on. And, you had scholars and folks, in public health coming out and said, well, what's really killing Black folks is racism. So you need to look at if Black folks are disproportionately high blood pressure, disproportionately having asthma and these type of conditions that makes them immunocompromised and so susceptible to COVID-19, then we need to look at their living conditions. And why are Black folks living in subpar conditions in 2020? So that COVID ravages them, right? And then looking at the type of service entry level positions that Black folks are doing, subway drivers, bus drivers, that these folks that had to continue to work. Everyone couldn't just shut down and be at home and self-isolate, right? You had to continue to work and look at the population, look at the demographics of those folks who continue to work before the vaccine, right? Before the mask mandate, right? Were Black folks. And so still continuing to die. So there was a real conversation, right, of racism, white supremacy, living under racism and living under white supremacy, right? White supremacy. That's really the reason and why Black folks are dying 2 to 1, and in some cases 2.5% to 1.
Yeah, so if I hear you talking, then it just seems too easy to say that, okay, Black people are less healthy, so that's the reason, because then you have to think, to elaborate on that, to think of what's behind that, so the background of those conditions, before you actually can give a real answer. And the real answer is the conditions in which they live, indeed, but that has its causes. It's caused by something, by something else, actually. Yeah, so it's a really amazing story, actually, to realize that this is happening. If you look back at your research, what you've done during the COVID-19 crisis, what can we learn from it? What can we take out of the research for living conditions, for future approaches of pandemics, but also for improving health conditions, and things like that?
Yeah, and I think we're still grappling with that. Inside of this global pandemic, spurned a lot of white supremacy, to the point that inside this global pandemic, there was a social unrest of 2020 that went global. Everyone around the world saw George Floyd murdered by a police officer with his hands in his pocket, right? So there's also a lack of believability with Black folks. When they did catch COVID, there were cases that came out where a particular Black woman, a school teacher in Brooklyn, called the ambulance and they said, no, you're fine, you're fine. She went to the hospital, the doctor checked her out, said, no, you're fine, you're fine. She died of COVID. That was not just one case. So the believability, right, that white supremacy is killing Black folks, right, on top of COVID, is something that I hope we really want to grapple with, right? When you ask me, what have we learned from this? What can we take away from this? Is that white supremacy is underneath all of this, and that we have to uproot it, right? We really have to uproot it. But then when you see things in the US, like the backlash against Roe v. Wade that we're dealing with right now, like the backlash against critical race theory, and actually teaching about how slavery is fundamental to the building of this country, then it makes you wonder, did we really learn anything, inside this global pandemic?